Planning out a Dungeons & Dragons campaign is a near impossible task, and I know there are a lot of people who will probably get confused by that. I mean, how many Dungeon Masters are out there which have planned campaigns? In fact, how many campaigns out there have already been written and read in books? You could see some of them behind me. It's something that has already occurred. However, it still is a near impossible task for one specific reason, which I will be getting into. But that being said, what I want to talk about today is how to start this monumental task that seems so impossible, especially for newer DMs, and how you can begin to tackle this task in order to be able to achieve that amazing campaign you're hoping for, as well as to bring your players into the process and make things a lot easier than you might seem. So, with that being said, let's talk about it. So, why is it that I say that creating a campaign is a near impossible task? Well, let me add a caveat into this. It's not impossible. However, creating a campaign world is. And the simple fact of the matter is, you can't create a whole world. It's impossible to be able to do that. And I know there are a lot of people out there who will probably argue with me and say, well, I've created worlds since I was 5 years old, and I create fantasy worlds all the time. I have my own fleshed out economy, my own fleshed out languages. I have the entire structure of the world built. That's great. That's fantastic. I'm so glad that you guys are able to do that. One, it is not necessary for your campaign. And two, I guarantee you it's not as fleshed out as you legitimately think it is. And the reason for that is we can't create a world that we live in. We are creatures who live in this world. And so the ability to create an entirely new world is basically impossible. And so when you set a campaign setting in front of somebody and you sit them down in order to be able to play, your table will ultimately end up doing something which surprises you. It shocks you. It confuses you. It will change how you saw your world because they are exploring it in ways that you never would have been able to think. You have to accept that you have limitations as a dungeon master and you need to revel in them. Please do not get discouraged because you feel like you can't create a whole world. You can't, but nobody's expecting you to. The real key to creating a campaign setting, a campaign world, and starting a campaign is just by making sure that you simplify things enough so that you can take care of it, and your players will never know the wiser. So let's jump into how to do that. One of the most common problems that I see with newer DMs is they try to plan out a campaign setting and world as if it were a video game, and that just doesn't work properly. See, in a video game, what you do is you can walk forward and the only thing that loads is what's in front of your character. It is the current situation that you're in and even the things that you're looking at. As you turn, things will deload behind you as you turn to load new sections of the world. And Dungeons & Dragons doesn't quite work that way because the human brain is simply much more powerful than any of the processing units and any consoles or computers. And so what that means is we have the ability to determine more. And we don't actually have to process seeing it or creating it. All we have to do is imagine it. And it is a much easier process. And so if you're going to try and develop things as a video game, there are only so many things that can load. But the human brain can imagine infinite things. And so it doesn't work out so well. And so what you have to keep in mind as a dungeon master is you cannot develop everything. You cannot create everything. Instead, when you're starting a campaign, you need to start with what I call pillars. Pillars in the world that you can then build off of. Consider it the foundation. The foundation of a building is the easiest thing to build, but it takes the longest. But once you have it built, it is a very simple process and you can then start creating things off of that easily. But if you tried to create the entire building at once, it would never work out, right? And so you have to create the foundation of your world. And what I would do in order to do that is determine 3 different things. 1, what are the dominant forces in the world? Is this a world run by dragons? Therefore, dragons are one of the most dominant forces. Or is it a highly complex political campaign and world and you need to figure out which different civilizations have major control over which areas? Or you need to figure out exactly who it is that is controlling the world from the shadows. Maybe there's a shadowy organization, or there's a large war between 2 different factions. But you have to figure out the dominant forces in the world because they will help you begin to build off of those things. If everything in the world is affected by those forces, then everything is going to build off of them. The second thing I would recommend that you do is figure out where food and water comes from. It's funny because we don't really think about it these days in the modern world where we can just pipe water to us from miles away and we can get food just delivered to our front doorstep. But it's important to remember that almost all human civilization starts with where they can get food and water. Why do you live where you are? If you consider the history of it and if you look back through the history of wherever it is you're living, I guarantee you it'll all come down to the fact that they found a source of of food and water that was consistent, and so they were able to start living off of it. And that's going to help you really develop your world. If you set this incredibly in-depth town and city in your map and you just really flesh it out, you know the political intrigue, you know the key players, you know everything about that, but there is no food and water nearby, that town is going to be less fleshed out. And yes, you can say that the food and water comes from magic. That's okay, it's a world of magic, but consider that. And that's the third thing I would consider, magic. D&D is a magical setting. There is magic baked into everything. Even if it's a low magic setting, magic still influences the world. Even one powerful wizard in a low magic setting could change everything. And so you have to consider how magic specifically affects your world. What does it do to influence your campaign setting and the world that you've created? That's really important to remember. And if you don't keep those things in mind, it can really cause to everything going flat very quickly. So just to recap, make sure that you consider what the dominant forces in your world are, where food and water comes from, and how magic affects your world. And those three things are going to create the nice foundation that will begin to develop the rest of the campaign. And things will happen naturally, I guarantee it. As you consider those dominant forces, you'll naturally ask yourself the questions of why? Why are they that powerful? How did they get that powerful? How did they get to the point where they are? And if you can continue to do that, you start to create a very, very good, well fleshed out world. But you still don't have to create everything, just the key components. And this is the largest tip that I can add that I think will really influence everything, and is one of the things that I do in every campaign I run. I let my players create the world. And I know that sounds weird. I don't just tell them, you come up with a campaign setting and I'll run it. No, that's ridiculous. Is I reach out to my players and I ask them to create their backstories with no limitations. I give them a basic overview of the world. This is what you're living in, this is the time period that it's in, here are the dominant forces. All of the pillars that I just told you guys to come up with. But once I've given them those pillars, I tell them the sky's the limit. You know the limitations of the world, create what you want. And so they'll do random things. One of the players said, I fought in a coliseum in a slave trading ring. I now know two things. There's a coliseum where death sports are a thing, and that therefore influences the world, because I have to figure out what kind of society supports death sports. And I have to consider if other societies have a problem with death sports. Is there a classist system now that puts the lower class people against each other? And now I have to consider a slave trading ring as well. That's something that exists in the world. Is that taboo? Is that commonplace? I get to develop those things because my players said they existed. And then when another player comes to me and says, hey, my parents disappeared at some point and I don't know where they are, I want you to come up with it. Well, hey, there's a coliseum and a slave trading ring. I now have a connection, and I can continue to develop this web together. There really is no better source or tool to create your world than the players. The players will create what they want to be there, and you will flesh it out and make it work in the world. And if it just doesn't work, if it absolutely doesn't work, if you created a world where you said lizard folk just don't exist, and they want to play a lizard folk, one, personally. My challenge as a DM and a Dungeon Master is to challenge you to let them do it. Figure out how to make it work. Well, lizard folks don't exist. They're extinct. They were genocided years ago, but now one of your players wants to play one? Figure out why that happened. Because that creates a far more interesting story than telling them no. I guarantee it. It is a far more interesting story to let them do it. You do not have to. It is still your world, and it is okay if you don't. But I personally really feel like that sort of challenge develops me as a Dungeon Master in a much better way. And ultimately, doesn't it make sense to let the players develop the world? Doesn't that really just add in a certain level of excitement for them? The world is for them, after all. The Dungeon Master should enjoy the world and creating it, absolutely. But the players should be the ones who really experience it. And if they are influential in the world, that leads to more investment. It leads to it being so much easier to draw them into your game, because you can mention things that they already have personal ties to, and it makes them feel like their characters are really a part of the world. And that really is the ultimate goal, unless, of course, you're playing an Isekai campaign, which, you know, if you're doing that, go for it. That's great, but I'm talking about something a little bit more specific here. If you do that, though, you really do create a world where there's so much more investment, a more entertaining sort of area for them to be able to explore and create and sandbox in. And as time goes on, you can develop it more and more, but don't overwhelm yourself. Create the pillars, let the players start to develop the world, and figure out what's important to develop from there. If you try and develop everything, you will exhaust yourself. And it's way too easy as a Dungeon Master to do that, so please, take care of yourself. You're just as important as everybody else. So go out into the world, make it your own, you beautiful bastards. Don't forget to have a great day, and never forget to play your own. A huge shout out to all those divine bastards over on our Patreon that helped make this video happen. Big D the Cool Guy, BKBW, Diet Blue, Duplicolor, Sassy Cat Productions, Sorit, Supreme Court, Talia Martin, Tenai, Void Mystic, and Volpe Nico. We wouldn't be able to do what we do without our patrons, and we are very thankful for your continued support. You guys are the absolute best, and I will never take your support for granted.